In the spring of 1944, in Western Europe, a battalion was assembled, equipped, and recorded on paper. Its soldiers received orders, serial numbers, and deployment schedules. But according to official records, the battalion never left its staging area. What happened to the men who were prepared for a war they were never meant to fight? By early 1944, Western Europe had become a vast administrative machine of war. Armies moved not only on roads and railways, but through forms, manifests, and carbon copies. Entire units could be created on paper before a single boot touched the ground. It was in this environment that the battalion was formed. The unit was assembled from replacements drawn across several regions. Some men were veterans recovering from wounds. Others were recent conscripts who had completed accelerated training. They arrived in waves, carrying personal gear and standardized rifles, reporting to an installation that barely appeared on maps. The camp itself was temporary. Wooden barracks, canvas structures, gravel paths worn down by constant marching. Everything suggested transience. Officially, the battalion's role was undefined. Internal documents described it as provisional. Its designation changed twice in 3 weeks. Command staff rotated in and out, reassigned before learning the names of the men under them. Training schedules were inconsistent. Live-fire exercises were planned, then cancelled. Maps were distributed, then collected without explanation. Rumors filled the gaps left by silence. Some believed the battalion was being held in reserve for the coming invasion. Others thought it was intended as a deception unit, meant to exist only to confuse enemy intelligence. The soldiers themselves were told very little. They drilled. They waited. They filled out paperwork. Every movement was logged. The men wrote letters home describing boredom rather than fear. They spoke of waiting rooms, of endless inspections, of nights interrupted by roll calls that served no apparent purpose. No one mentioned combat. No one mentioned deployment. The absence of clarity became routine. What made the battalion unusual was not what it did, but what it failed to do. Supply records showed rations issued and consumed. Medical logs recorded minor injuries. Disciplinary reports were filed. Everything necessary to confirm the unit's existence was present. Yet there were no transport orders. No embarkation dates. No assigned front. By April, some soldiers noticed discrepancies. Pay records arrived late or not at all. Identification numbers failed to match central registries. Mail sometimes returned unopened, marked with clerical errors. When questioned, officers deferred responsibility upward. Higher command never responded. On paper, the battalion was intact. In reality, it hovered in a state between preparation and erasure. The men continued to wait, unaware that their greatest role in the war might be to disappear without ever being recorded as present. As preparations for major operations intensified elsewhere, the battalion remained stationary. Nearby units moved out under cover of night. Convoys passed the camp without stopping. The sound of distant artillery became more frequent, but never closer. The war advanced around them. Administrative pressure increased. Orders arrived contradicting previous directives. One morning, the battalion was instructed to prepare for immediate movement. By evening, the order was rescinded. Equipment was packed and unpacked repeatedly. Ammunition was issued, then collected. Vehicles were assigned, then reassigned to other units. Personnel changes accelerated. Individual soldiers were quietly transferred out, reassigned to replacement pools without ceremony. No official announcement explained their absence. New names appeared on rosters, often misspelled. the unit's identity became increasingly unstable. An internal review was reportedly initiated. Inspectors arrived briefly, asked questions, and left with boxes of documents. After their departure, several files went missing. The battalion's designation was altered again, this time retroactively. Earlier records were stamped administrative error. Training ceased almost entirely. Days passed with no drills. Guards were posted, then withdrawn. Officers avoided gatherings. The men sensed that something had shifted, but no one explained what it was. By late May, the camp began to empty. Not through deployment, but through subtraction. Barracks were closed. Supply deliveries stopped. Medical staff departed. A notice board listed names of men to report elsewhere, but never listed where they were going. Those who remained were instructed to destroy personal documents deemed non-essential. Letters, notes, photographs. The justification was security. The effect was erasure. Identity was reduced to serial numbers that no longer corresponded to anything. When inquiries were made, responses became formal and distant. The battalion, soldiers were told, was under review. It was pending clarification. It was not currently active. No explanation accounted for months of preparation or the men still present. The most troubling development emerged quietly. Central Command records no longer matched local logs. In some registries, the battalion ceased to exist weeks earlier. In others, it had never been activated. Requests for clarification were returned unanswered. The soldiers continued to exist physically. They ate. They slept. They stood in formation. But administratively, they were becoming invisible. The war demanded efficiency. Anything that did not fit was removed. By the end of May 1944, the battalion had become an anomaly. And anomalies, in wartime, rarely survive documentation. The decisive moment did not arrive with gunfire. It arrived with silence. In early June 1944, a final order was issued. It was brief. The battalion was to be stood down. No ceremony followed. No explanation was offered. The order carried no signatures recognizable to the men who read it. Over the next days, the remaining soldiers were dispersed individually. Not as a unit. Not as a group. Names were called. Men were handed new orders with altered identification numbers. Some were sent to replacement depots. Others vanished into administrative transit with no clear destination. There was no final roll call. No record of deactivation. The battalion flag was never presented or retired. It simply ceased to appear. Later reviews would show contradictions. Some documents indicated the battalion had been absorbed into other formations. Others suggested it had been cancelled before deployment. A few files listed it as deployed, without specifying where or when. None matched eyewitness accounts. Casualty records showed nothing. No deaths. No injuries. No engagements. It was as if the unit had passed through the war without touching it. For the men, the consequences were immediate and disorienting. Without a unit history, their service became difficult to verify. Benefits were delayed or denied. Questions were met with confusion. The battalion name produced no results. Years later, attempts to reconstruct its story failed. Files had been destroyed. Microfilm was incomplete. Testimonies conflicted. No official acknowledgement ever corrected the record. The battalion had existed long enough to consume months of lives. It trained. It waited. It obeyed. Then it dissolved without leaving a trace strong enough to survive bureaucracy. The war moved on. Landings occurred. Fronts shifted. Victory was declared. But the battalion remained unresolved. It had reached its climax not in battle, but in omission. Not through loss, but through deletion. The battalion did not return as a unit. It did not assemble one last time. There was no final order read aloud. Men were reassigned quietly. One name at a time. One paper at a time. Some were sent to other formations. Others entered replacement pools. A few moved through administrative transit without clear destination. The battalion itself was never formally dissolved. It was not honored. It was not recorded as lost. Its designation stopped appearing in reports. Then in rosters. Then in archives. In some documents, it existed briefly. In others, it was never activated. Several files contradicted each other completely. Months of service could not be verified. Pay records failed to align. Unit histories showed gaps where the battalion should have been. The men carried memories without confirmation. Training without deployment. Waiting without resolution. When questions were asked, answers were uncertain. Clerks searched indexes. Officers reviewed microfilm. Nothing matched. There were no casualty lists. No battle citations. No movement orders tied to a front. From an official perspective, nothing had happened. Yet time had passed. Lives had been paused. The camp was dismantled. Barracks removed. Ground leveled. Grass returned. Roads faded. Only faint traces remained. Without documentation, memory weakened. Without memory, recognition disappeared. Some veterans tried to explain. Their stories were incomplete. Often dismissed as errors. Without a unit name, their service became abstract. Hard to place. Easy to overlook. Years later, historians found fragments. Partial logs. And signed directives. They pointed to a formation that existed just long enough to vanish. A battalion created for war. Prepared for movement. Absorbed by paperwork. It left no battlefield behind. No grave markers. No official ending. Only absence. A unit that stood ready. Waited. Then was erased. Officially, it never deployed. In reality, it slowly disappeared. And in that disappearance, it became forgotten. These stories are rarely told. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one.